Beyond the Valley.
Hello and welcome to another episode of CNBC's Beyond the Valley. I'm Arjun Kapil here in London. Yes, I've moved back to London from Guangzhou. A bit of a change of scenery, but we're back after a few months with a brand new episode of the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about Web3. It's a term, it's a buzzword at the moment for sure in the world of the internet. And we're going to be speaking to the man who coined that phrase back in 2014. But before we get into Web3, we need to understand a little bit about what exactly Web 1 and Web 2 are so we can talk about the future. Now, Web 1 is what we saw in the 90s. That was really about static web pages. It was based on so-called open protocols, and the idea was for it not to be centralized, i.e. owned by a single entity. And this idea of centralization versus decentralization is something we're going to talk a lot about in this episode because it's very key to the idea of Web 3. Then came Web 2 in the early 2000s, and that very much is the internet that we know today. We've seen the emergence of social media, user-generated content, the ad-driven business models as well, but also the birth of internet giants, huge billion-dollar companies that are very key to the internet as we know it as well. And with the Web 2 came centralization, and that idea is that a lot of what we do online goes through platforms or infrastructure owned by some of these huge giants. If you think about the platforms we use, Facebook and Twitter, and of course, the infrastructure based on companies like Amazon and Microsoft, you can see where that idea has come from. And many say these companies operate walled gardens or closed ecosystems as well. And of course, the Web 2 that we know really is under the purview of central government regulators as well. So fast forward now to Web 3. This is currently what technologists are trying to work on and attempting to change the status quo of Web 2. The key to this is really about decentralization. And as I mentioned, we'll get more into that term, but it's the idea that no single entity will be able to own whatever the future of the internet begins to look like. Apps will run on algorithms and consensus, and there are a few technologies that could be a key part of that. One of those is blockchain technology, something we've heard a lot about as it relates to cryptocurrencies as well, when we know some of those platforms like Ethereum, like Polkadot, are working towards Web3 applications as well. Another key part of Web3 is the fact that the people working on it say that it will be trustless. Again, another key term we will dig into further in the conversation we're about to have now, but it's something that the idea goes that currently in Web 2, we have to trust companies like Google, like Facebook, etc., with our data, with carrying out their services, etc. But that won't necessarily happen with Web 3, where we can work on a trustless system. As I mentioned, we will dig into that. And proponents of Web 3 say that it will be censorship resistant, as well as giving users more control of their data. But look, we're in the very early days of Web 3 right now. There's no unified definition. Web 3 is something different to different people as well, but there are a number of projects underway, and I'm really excited because we're about to catch up now with Gavin Wood, who is the co-founder or one of the co-founders of Ethereum, a blockchain platform you may know a bit about, but also the founder of Parity Technologies, which has a blockchain platform called Polkadot. He coined the term Web3 in 2014, and so he's got his own views on this. Gavin, thanks for joining me here on Beyond the Valley. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me here, Arjun.
So let's kick off the conversation then. And before we get into how we're defining Web3, what that might look like, tell me your view on what you believe right now is the current problem with the way the web is designed with Web 2.
I think it comes down to the fact that Web 2 is largely a sort of carbon copy in terms of the social architecture, in terms of like the power architecture. It's a carbon copy of society that we've that created Web 2. By that, what I mean is that we have these relatively large institutions that control like the important services. In sort of the real world, we're talking about like banks, insurance companies, a lot of financial things. Um, and we're talking about many of the major corporates. On the internet world, we see that, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, so on. Now this this has the big problem with this is that it's the sort of the same thing as placing all your eggs in one basket. If something goes wrong with one of these services, then the service is suddenly unavailable for an awful lot of people. Furthermore, where the key word here is trust. We're having to trust the people behind the services. We're having to trust the owners of the companies that run the service, and we're having to trust many of the employees with very important stuff that I think we're only just coming to realize how important it is. Data being one of them, our communications being another. And so, we kind of managed to architect ourselves into this somewhat like dystopian version of what the world could be.
So then when you look forward to the concept of Web3, which sort of at the moment has a lot of different definitions to a lot of different people, nothing quite unified yet. But when you look at your idea of Web3, what does that look like, and how does that look to change the current status quo?
Really, for me, Web3 is about reducing the amount of trust that we need to give in order to use the services that we rely on every day, whether it's trading, whether it's communication. The things that we sort of have increasingly come to rely on the internet for, and within the internet, like, we have really now tended towards mobile and web as the sort of main ways of getting to these services. So these are the sort of platforms that we use, and Web3 is really a sort of an alternative vision of the web, where the services that we use are not like hosted by a single service provider company, but rather they're sort of purely algorithmic things that are in some sense hosted by everybody. So it's like it's very peer-to-peer, right? It's the idea being that all participants sort of contribute a small slice of the ultimate service, and thus no one really has any advantage over anyone else in the same, not in the same sense, at least, as when you, for example, go to Amazon or you go to eBay or Facebook, where the company behind the service really has absolute power over what it is that they do in providing the service.
So when you talk about this, the fact that we trust a lot of these large companies with things like our data, with them to run these services, we then move on to this idea of a trustless model with Web3. How does that look from a technological perspective? Because there's so many technologies that are floated around Web3, whether it be blockchain that leads to decentralization, whether it's cryptocurrencies as well. How is it that this trustless web comes about?
Technologically speaking, there are a few sort of currents to what I sort of coined as Web3 back in 2014. Broadly speaking, they center around communication and managing communication sort of expectations. I mean, that's really what it's about. Like, when I talk to my brother over the phone, I don't expect there to be anyone else listening to it. It's not like the phone service has given me some absolute guarantee of privacy, but nonetheless, my expectations are that no one would be listening to it. And the problem is that we've seen that many of these sort of expectations, particularly as technology has moved onto packet-based network, onto the internet, these expectations have become weaker. The expectations have remained the same. The reality is that the expectations are increasingly not met. And so part of Web3 is really, the whole of Web3 is about delivering on these expectations that we sort of already had, but ensuring that the technology actually helps enforce our expectations rather than having to trust somebody to do that. So part of this is about using cryptography in order to help guarantee privacy. And I'm intentionally being a little bit sort of I'm intentionally using words like probably and help do something, and reduce rather than remove, because at the end of the day there are no absolute guarantees. What we are working is to reduce the amount of trust that we have to do. We can never remove it entirely, and we have to be realistic about that. But so one of the ways that we do it, like cryptography, another way that we do it, as you mentioned, blockchain, and this helps us helps us get the expectations about what our dealing is. So it's like, if we want to do a transaction, maybe it's a foreign exchange transaction, right? It's like I have some pound sterling and I want to get some dollars. I might I might use this technology in order to make that exchange. And the idea is that I don't have to I have some expectation that, for example, no one's like making money off no one's making too much money like off my exchange. Maybe there's like a market rate, and I only get like a little bit under the market rate. Well, I have much more guarantees about my expectations being met if it's done sort of without the need to trust anyone, without the possibility of someone like having the power over me to be able to alter the exchange rate, or whatever, in some sense make the deal better for them than it would otherwise be for me. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's about introducing, much about blockchain is about introducing accountability, verifiability, in order to reduce the impact of needing to trust, or reduce the amount of trust itself.
And I think that's a really good example. I think a lot of people might be thinking about, well, what does this mean for sort of some of the everyday apps I'm using, social media apps? We know some of the largest companies in the world are in the business of social media or search, or even some of the internet infrastructure. So if there's someone watching this going, well, what does that mean? What does a version of Twitter on Web3 look like? What does a version of Facebook on Web3 look like, or some of the other popular apps they use?
Web3 is sort of been coming at it from a direction that is not trying to replicate sort of the existing Web2, behemoths that we have in the world. But yeah, I think it's important to understand that like Web3 is in part solving alternative problems. So it's not necessarily going to wholly replace Web2 in the same way that Web2 didn't really wholly replace Web1. There were still very much Web1 websites out there. It's just that the really big ones that have sort of gotten entrenched in our lives do tend to be Web2. But yeah, I mean, if we start thinking about maybe a Web3 version of Twitter, it's going to start looking like something which I have control over my posts. So I don't know, maybe I can remove them all if I choose. Maybe if maybe there's an increased amount of awareness about where the posts come from. So it's much harder for someone to fake my identity because we have cryptographic based proofs that I have done this, and only I could possibly have done this. We have probably elements of sort of greater freedom of speech that would make their way into there, in the sense that the system isn't going to inherently have gatekeepers, that in the same way that there are Twitter employees that act effectively as gatekeepers to the system.
What I was just wondering more about, when people begin using apps built upon Web3 platforms, will they say, oh look, I'm using a Web3 app, it's noticeable, or are they just using another app that perhaps works in a different way?
So I think the trick will be to make it the latter, right? Because at the moment it's very much the former. It's like, right, I have to download this and I have to configure that and I have to go here and there. It's it's relatively complex to use a sort of truly Web3 app in a safe, secure, decentralized manner. Now, there are a lot of portals that sort of really relax a lot of the decentralization in favor of making it easier. But in the fullness of time, then I think the services, the Web3 services that sort of will come to be used will be largely indistinguishable in terms of user experience from like Web2 services, the main points of differentiation will be maybe a little bit more information delivered through the service, probably if it's done properly in a fairly subtle fashion, that users will kind of pick up on a lot of the time subconsciously, but that won't impact the overall sort of service.
I wanted to pick up on a couple other concepts and parts of the Web3 occasion as well, Gavin. Firstly, this, and we've been sort of speaking about it throughout this conversation, this idea of decentralization. And, you know, we've heard the term as it applies to things like Bitcoin, for example, and the way that works. But what does it mean for Web3 and the way that apps in Web3 will work as well?
So decentralization, the first thing to do is clear up a small sort of a little bit of confusion that arises around the term decentralization. So decentralization kind of comes in two flavors. One of them is where you distribute the assets, the computation machinery, the servers, right, into, like, you know, many different places, usually like geographically distributed, as a means of basically speeding the service up for everybody, no matter where they are on the globe. So this is what, for example, Google and Facebook do. They got tens, hundreds of thousands of servers all dotted around the globe, all very fast, very speedily connected to each other, and it allows them to provide a very effective service. It's still politically centralized, right? The CEO of Zuckerberg of Facebook, or you know, CEO of Microsoft, Google, whatever, if they decide to turn them all off, they can, right? It's just a flick of the switch away for them. They probably hear from the board not very long afterwards, but in principle they hold that power. The decentralization that we're talking about is political decentralization. So this is where the power itself is decentralized, right? There isn't a single person that can, like, turn off Bitcoin. That's the CEO of Bitcoin doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist by design, right? There literally isn't. There could never be, assuming, you know, the fundamentals of Bitcoin are sound, there could never be a CEO of Bitcoin able to actually switch the network off. So then it's like, well, what's the point? Why do we do decentralization? I mean, the best answer to this that I found is it's kind of the same reason that we do encryption, right? It allows us to have a credible expectation, right, about the service that we're going to get. So with encryption, it allows us to credibly expect that we'll have privacy, that it is literal, that no one's listening in on the call. Even this call, we're doing it over the internet. We're using encryption. It's not a given, right, that this is absolutely private. There might be spyware installed on one or the other laptop. There could be like a bug in the room. I don't know, whatever. But it's far less likely than if we were doing this over the clear, if we're doing just standard HTTP. Decentralization allows a similar sort of increase in what we can credibly expect from our service. For example, with Bitcoin, it's decentralized, which means we can credibly expect that there isn't a single actor that can censor our transaction, or that can lock our account, that can prevent us from spending our money, that can steal our money, right? These are all things that, because it's decentralized by design, we now have a credible expectation of. We don't have that credible expectation with if our funds are custodied by a bank, or if we're trying to use a service like PayPal, right? Because there is a CEO of PayPal that can flick the switch on my account, on the service, on the network, whatever. But there is that power is held by a single individual, and in some cases without too much accountability. And furthermore, we will never know if there is accountability or not, because we're not allowed to look into PayPal's corporate structure and look at, and audit it and check the processes in place, and all the rest of it. So because we have decentralization, we are able to get more credible expectations of privacy, of non-censorability, of freedom, of service provision. And decentralization is one of a number of things that we use to do this. We use advanced mathematics. We use cryptography. We use some very exotic bits of cryptography. We use game theory increasingly as well. All in order to make sure that our expectations about these services will be met, regardless of the desires or incompetence or maliciousness of anybody else in the world.
So on top of decentralization, another thing that people are looking at when it comes to Web3 is, well, what role does digital tokens and other cryptocurrencies play in the mix as well? You've got this idea that, well, there might be some platforms that are powered by certain digital tokens, and they're going to be a key part of the Web3 mix and Web3 applications. Where do you stand on that?
So the concept of currency was like the first service, right, that this technology provided. It's blockchain technology, Bitcoin, currency that everyone knows now. And it was like, we don't need a Bitcoin corp, right? We don't need a Bitcoin company to provide the service of a currency. We can do it sort of by everyone having a little slice of the network, doing their bit, and we sort of have this service come up from the bottom. And I think it was a great sort of demonstration. It got it sort of took my imagination, and I think it took a lot of other people's imagination. And this is where sort of we have got the sort of basics of Web3 from. I don't necessarily I think tokens can be very useful. So, back in the early days, back in like 2014, when we were first sort of designing Ethereum, it came up that we're like, maybe we don't want to have a token in Ethereum. Like, why are we building a currency into this thing? Do we really need it? Like, it's meant to be like a computation platform. Like, why should it have a currency? Now, the reason that we kept the currency in was because it provided a safeguard against misuse of the system, effectively by requiring this sort of this economic transaction, this like, giving something economically valuable up by a user meant that users couldn't sort of spam the system with useless transactions or otherwise like abuse it. Effectively, by putting a price on it, you're sort of turning away the people who would abuse the system. And that we needed a token in order to be able to put a price on the service. Obviously, you can't pay with cash if it's an internet-based service. We can't use like a bank or PayPal or anything like that. So, like, we needed a token as part of the service. And I think this model is reasonable. And we've definitely seen, as you said, like a lot of teams sort of announce a token that can be used to pay for their service. It's an easy way of mitigating this kind of abuse of the system. I don't think it's necessarily. I don't think that currency per se is necessarily like a going to be an enduring killer app, right? I think there probably will be other applications that will overshadow currency itself, kind of in the same way that the internet sort of started with, I don't know, news, the Usenet, the sort of news service, and email, and they're being increasingly overshadowed by all the other services that we've come to use. I think it'll probably be fairly similar. I suspect that currency will continue to play a role in services. Overall, we're going to start seeing services be delivered without the need to use tokens. And I think that's going to be a big jump. And I think it is one of the key factors that's going to open the door to the mainstream. Quite honestly, I don't think many people who want to use some of the interesting services that are coming out really want to own platform tokens. Like, I don't think they want to like buy into, I don't know, whatever exchange token thing, and then also into ETH in order to use the exchange. And then actually do the service. I think they just want to do the service. And if you can provide the service without all of this extra stuff that people need to do and own and control, then I think you've got a much greater chance of effectively selling your product into the mass market.
I mean, what does that mean then for this complex of digital currencies and digital tokens that we have right now? Because every time there's a new project that pops up, they're like, hey, look at our flashy new token we have. And there's some price action involved with that. There's just hundreds of these tokens. So, I mean, what does that mean for this complex then of all these tokens that are in existence?
I don't think that I don't think like a multi-currency world is going to go away. I think it's inherently useful to have like a token which kind of represents the economy of a service. Like, it's a relatively new model, and it's kind of interesting. It does allow it allows some things that you couldn't otherwise get. At the moment, we've got this weird thing where there's like a company that's behind one or more services, and you can kind of maybe buy into the company on the stock exchange, but it's quite hard. There's no way that your small holdings are really going to affect governance of the company. Oftentimes the company is private anyway, so you can't, there's no way that you can buy in. And we have like an alternative model now where in principle you have much more direct control. You have you can form bodies that can sort of collectives that can wield power within the governance of the service.
I'm glad you brought up governance as well, Gavin, because that is a big debate at the moment. How does governance work in the world of Web3? And of course, you mentioned there, traditional companies, you might buy some shares in it, but ultimately, unless you've got billions invested in some of the biggest companies and the correct voting rights for your shares, you're not going to be able to influence some of those decisions. So as you look at the world of Web3, one of the ideas as well, look, if there's a platform that has tokens involved with it, perhaps it's to do with how many tokens you have, or perhaps it's to do with how long you've been holding those tokens, or many other kind of theories around how governance exactly works with Web3. What would you say is the best way for that in your view? How should governance work in the world of Web3?
I think it's very much an unsolved problem. So I don't really want to stick my neck out and say what the best thing is. I think this is still something that's going to be developed a lot over the next years and probably decades. Overall, I think a good governance should combine elements of technocratic decision making. So try and get experts to make the best decisions, whilst also accepting the fact that a majority of stakeholders can ultimately sink the service if they so choose. Like if you have the very nature of this kind of collective ownership and service provision, that if a particular service, particularly like proof of stake services, which tend to be like the next generation of cryptocurrencies, crypto projects, are generally sort of controllable by a strict majority or by maybe a super majority. We have to accept the fact that a majority can essentially destroy or severely handicap at least the service. So they can, if you don't have the backing of the majority, you're kind of already screwed. So what we need to do is ensure that there is a backstop, a sensible backstop that allows the majority to exercise its power in a sensible way, whilst also assuming that the majority are broadly happy with sort of the direction that maybe a technocratic minority are happy to take it in. Then they can be kind of delegated, or there is a way of ensuring that they don't need to be around day-to-day decisions if they don't really want to be, and a lot of the time they don't. I think it's a difficult question to answer. I think we have to be very careful about what it is that we want to achieve. Overall, I do think that we can do a lot better than coin voting, than this one coin, one vote, and I think we can definitely do a lot better than classic Athenian democracy, or what it was in principle, which was one head, one vote. I think we can sort of look towards certain game theoretic economic mechanisms to try to make sure that the decisions that are made actually do fulfill the goal that we want. And one of the ways that we're sort of spearheading this in Polkadot is to have this concept of conviction voting, right? So conviction voting is basically where you lock yourself into the system voluntarily, basically saying, I won't move my coins, I won't sell them, I won't spend them, I won't transfer them anywhere. They're kind of frozen, locked for a particular period of time, with the idea being that the longer that you agree that you voluntarily lock them for, the greater the overall weight of your vote. So it's like by saying I'm going to stick around for the long haul, maybe 24 months, then you get much more voting power than you would with someone with the same amount of tokens, but who is unwilling to lock them at all. And I think I'm cautiously optimistic that this will allow the system to make overall better long-term decisions rather than be solely focused on short-term needs.
And I do want to address, I guess, just in this next part of the conversation, a bit about some of the risks, challenges, criticisms as well of Web3 so far. And I'll pull a couple up at the moment. One high profile one, of course, was the Twitter founder, Jack Dorsey, talking about Web3, saying, it's the venture capitalists and their limited partners really that own Web3. He said it will never really escape their incentives, and it's ultimately a centralized entity with a different label. And of course, you've also had the founder of Signal, Moxie Marlinspike, talking about Web3 as it stands is not really decentralized. You sort of need to platforms are emerging, but to access those and the blockchain, you need to go via other interfaces as well. So as you listen to those two criticisms and challenges at the moment, what are your thoughts about the risk of centralization when it does come to Web3?
So I would say that they're two very different criticisms, and I think it may well be true that there are some protocols that are really just Web3 in name, are largely centralized. They're largely under the heavy influence, if not direct control, of a single group with a single economic alignment. This, if that's what sort of Jack was referencing, then there's maybe some latitude there. But I think that's not the Web3 I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about the legitimate protocols, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Polkadot. These are, I think, much more. These do not sacrifice decentralization, the guarantee of expectations, in favor of convenience, ease, speed, and all of the other sort of market-worthy terms. Overall, the key difference that I think is not represented by in sort of Jack's statement is that these systems are rules-based. They're fundamentally rules-based, even the ones that have a lot of VC backing. Yes, the VCs may get richer if the system does well, but I mean that's just the nature of investment. The key thing is, do the VCs have the ability to switch the rules on the users? Like, can they basically mutate the service into something that the users didn't want? In the same way that Facebook, for example, can just switch the terms and conditions. Yeah, Moxie brings up an interesting point, which was basically that a lot of the most used decentralized services, their users go through one or more centralized layers in order to use them. And again, this is essentially a big example here would be Ethereum, right? Ethereum is a decentralized service. It's a blockchain. It's run by many different miners who all contribute a bit of compute power and help push transactions through. Great. And if you use the blockchain directly, if you run your own Ethereum node, so you have to download, it's quite a lot of effort. Then you can legitimately run Ethereum in the way that it was sort of intended, and as it says on the tin, as advertised, it's actually decentralized. But most people don't do that because it's a lot of effort and it's not very convenient. So most people will go through a service called Infura and MetaMask. And Infura is basically it's run by a single company. And they spin up all these Ethereum nodes around the world to allow people to access Ethereum. But of course, they access Ethereum through a very much trusted entity, and they just sort of trust this service to like tell them all about the Ethereum blockchain, what's going on, what transactions have happened, and of course, if it's compromised, then in principle you can put user funds at risk. You can do all. It can be insecure and unsafe. And this is as far as I understand it, like kind of Mox's point. The core of it might be decentralized, but a lot of the sort of, as you get closer to the user, it's still heavily centralized. These services were only really meant to be a stopgap to allow, for this for the period while we hadn't quite got the technology developed yet that would allow users to actually use a decentralized service all the way through the journey from their computer to Ethereum. With Polkadot, we are very much focusing on ensuring that this entire journey from user to blockchain and back again is properly decentralized. So we have technology that allows us to actually interact with the blockchain, with the peers on the blockchain network directly from the browser. And what this means is, in reality, that users will go to a page or a website, whatever, and they will be able to be guaranteed that their browser is actually legitimately sort of connecting in to a decentralized sort of cloud of nodes and is checking what the information it's getting from the nodes, is validating the proofs. So we don't have to trust the nodes in the same way that any other node on the network doesn't trust the other nodes blindly. It verifies, it validates, and any nodes that is found to be trying to trick it at all are sort of tagged as malicious and disconnected. This is in my mind a very crucial thing to do, and I think Mox is absolutely right for bringing it up. And I think it's it will be a key differentiator, if it isn't already, between blockchain systems that sort of do provide this fully decentralized journey to the ones that sort of don't. That is really just aiming to cash in on the Web3 sort of name.
There's just two more points that I want to talk about, Gavin, and the first one is, I guess, where regulation fits into all this, because you will see some platforms come up that are perhaps in the decentralized finance space and dealing with areas that are heavily regulated and could potentially be in the purview of regulators. I can't see regulators sort of seeing a platform where, well, just because you're decentralized, you don't have to adhere to things like know your customer or anti-money laundering laws and these kind of things as well. So how do you see at this point regulators interact with the future of the web?
Bitcoin is unregulated, and it's providing a service that I think would otherwise, if it were hosted by a single entity, be regulated. Other services, there were services a bit similar to Bitcoin. eGold is a notable one that sort of came out 10, 15 years before Bitcoin. And they were shut down by regulators. It was determined that they were doing money transmission, they were breaking KYC, AML laws, whatever. Bitcoin didn't get shut down, right? And this isn't because the regulators decided that Bitcoin was great or was somehow in their acting in their interests or acting under the guidance of regulation. It was basically because they couldn't shut it down. Like the technology that was this decentralized technology was actually working, and it was the expectations that I mentioned before, like the expectation that a single economic actor cannot break your system, break your guarantees, were true. In this case, the single economic actor was an element of the government, of one of the Western governments. and they were unable to break the sort of broad guarantee of Bitcoin, which is that you can put a transaction through and you won't be censored. I don't think we're necessarily going to find regulators say, when you hit this level of decentralization, then we give you a free pass. But I think going off what we've seen with Bitcoin, there will probably be a greater understanding that when you hit this level of decentralization, to the point that there is really nobody whose door we could knock on to take the service down, then we're probably going to accept that you are in the same class of things as Bitcoin, and we will not necessarily like it, but we will put up with it. Now, you might find services that actually voluntarily implement regulations from within one or more of the sort of major powers, and they do this basically because they're not sure if they are sufficiently decentralized. They're not sure if maybe there will be a knock on the door, or because they actually they do it out of their own self-interest in terms of product. Like, they want to make their product more available to a bigger group of people, and by making it fit under the regulatory framework, they can do that. For those blockchains, they really are going to need to work things out for themselves. And for the ones that are truly decentralized, I would hope we get to a point where I guess a level of the same level of realism on the part of the global regulators that we seem to have arrived at with Bitcoin, which is that it's the service itself is unlikely to be regulatable just at a practical level, and therefore we should look towards regulating. If regulation is needed, we should look towards regulating the sort of users of the service rather than the service itself. So really try to avoid this desire to kind of influence the big entity and pare things down to something a bit more manageable. And it may well be that the cost of regulating individual users outweighs the benefit of the actual regulation. And maybe it will, maybe it won't. But if it doesn't, then what we will see is like basically less regulation. And I would hope a replacement of this relatively blunt instrument that is state regulation with a much more agile sort of instrument, which is algorithmic regulation, which is basically using the openness and the transparency and some of the tools that these kinds of services, these kinds of cryptographic and game theoretic based services provide the user, that might mean that some forms of regulation are not really needed.
Another big part of, I guess, the conversation about Web3 and is one of the consequences of it, and that could be that potentially the power of some of these tech giants at the moment could diminish to some extent. That's what a lot of proponents say about what Web3 could do to the current state of power of these tech companies. Do you buy into that?
I think it's going to be hard to make a dent in these Goliaths. I think realistically, we're gonna. Maybe it's a similar model to like Microsoft in the 90s, right? Huge monopolistic power, like huge sway, 90+% control of the market. But the reality was that the world changed around them. So they didn't do anything wrong, right? They did, and there was no customer. There was no like Apple or IBM that managed to outcompete them. It's just that the world changed, and what they were providing was just not that relevant anymore. It didn't matter that you were running the Windows operating system or authoring your document in Microsoft Word into 2010. Like, we had other thing. We used the web as a platform, and the web could be used on any operating system. We have we stopped buying boxed software. We just used the web, and we went to a URL with like Google Docs. It's like, all right, now I can basically do everything I did on Microsoft Word, but I can do it online. I don't pay anything. And I've instantly got connectivity with everybody else. I can share it easily and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, you know, the world changed. And I think maybe, you know, with Facebook's move to Meta, like we do see some efforts to like preempt the world changing around these services. But ultimately, I think I would hope that like Web3 fulfills the needs of the future in a way that can never really be fulfilled by these centralized service providers. But I don't see like a fight happening, right? I think, you know, I think it will either happen because the world changes and people suddenly realize that they need these guarantees, this credible expectations that the Web3 gives them. I don't think that that like they're going to outcompete Web2 purely based on like products.
And Gavin, just a final one as we wrap up this conversation. What is the risk that, you know, Web3 is ultimately just this utopian vision that doesn't come to pass in the end?
Yeah, I think visions are why builders build, and you know, I think when you start, well, at least when I start down a project, yeah, I have a pretty you know, idealistic way of imagining what it is that I will get once I've built it, and I don't think it ever really happens. Like maybe it's in my life, it's happened maybe twice that I've set off building something non-trivial and it's turned out at least as good as what I've been expecting. Most of the time, you know, it either takes longer, you get kind of stuck halfway, or you build it and then it's like, yeah, you know, yeah, didn't quite hit the goal that I was wanting. I think it doesn't matter though, right? I think that I think that we need these sort of idealistic visions about what it is that we're doing in order to just kind of get through the day and do it and enjoy it and be excited about it. Curiosity is crucial. It's like, can it be as good as I imagine? And maybe at the end of the day, you know, it will be half as good as this like amazing utopian dream, but it will still, in my mind, be better than what we have at the moment, which is you know, a world based upon essentially authoritarian power. We hope that it's benevolent, we hope that it's honest, we hope that we can trust them, and a lot of the time we're forced into trusting them, and a lot of the time this trust is not really evidence-based trust, it's blind faith. And I think a world based around that isn't so great, and so maybe we can't remove all of that. Maybe we can only reduce it a little bit, but like I would say it's still moving in the right direction to remove this this reliance on authority.
Gavin, that's a really nice way to end the conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks for conversing, Arjun. It was really fun.
Absolutely fascinating conversation with Gavin Wood there, who of course coined the term Web3 in 2014. What's very clear is that we're in the early stages of whatever Web3 might end up looking like. Lots of development going on here, lots of grand ideas. I did ask at the end there, is this just a utopia? Because that really is what it sort of appears to be at this point in time. And there are sort of some big questions that still remain, of course. Will Web3 go mainstream? Or will it just be for a few people who are very interested in technology? Will the tech giants be involved? And will it actually diminish their power as well, as some proponents say? And ultimately, will we see the landscape of the internet as we know it change? Now, there's no doubt this is a topic we will revisit on the podcast at some point as the technology begins to develop. And if you want to hear a little bit more about some of the concepts we talked about, Bitcoin, Ethereum, blockchain, we have plenty of episodes on that in the Beyond the Valley series. as well. But let me know what you thought about today's episodes and your views on Web3. You can comment below. You can also reach out directly. I'm on Twitter at Arjun Karpal. Would love to get your thoughts, but that's it for now for another episode of CNBC's Beyond the Valley. Thanks for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time.
Beyond the Valley.